Our landscapes are shared by myriad creatures, but when we compete for resources and space, conflict can be near.
So I was more than 100 meters away from the initial point where I was fishing. However, my sister-in-law was the other side, looking the opposite side from where my kids were seated. And then they are the ones who just saw the point when the crocodile was now snatching the baby. So when they saw that incident happening, I just heard them calling the child here. And then they were all crying. They were just crying, calling out that the kid here, the kid here. So that's only what I heard.
That's unbelievable.
The half of the boat was swallowed by the crocodile. So it's only from the leg portion going, these are the parts which are outside the body of the mouth of the crocodile.
So he was head first in the crocodile's mouth?
What I did, I went straight after touching the nose. The crocodile stopped moving, and then I had to put my hand inside the mouth, and then I grabbed something which is like a tongue. This is the one I started pulling. When I pulling at the same time, I was pushing the babe outside the mouth of the crocodile. So when I took the baby out, the baby had momentarily ceased breathing. So that's when my sister-in-law came and took a handful of sand and he had to strike twice on the belly. That's when he started showing some signs of breathing.
I always think that Loch Lomond is the first proper bit of wild Scotland that you encounter as you head north. You know, a lot of this landscape looks a lot like it would have done not just hundreds but thousands of years ago. The oak woodlands that we have here on the fringes of the lochs, the islands themselves are heavily wooded. So if I'm ever wanting to escape the city and the stresses of life, Loch Lomond is a place that I always come to. When I was growing up on the Isle of Mull, I did have a love of wildlife, but more than that, I loved the outdoors, and wildlife was just sort of part of that experience of being outside. And I think, you know, my earliest years, a lot of kind of peace and contentment came from being in nature. I've always sought out the wildest parts of my world. Back when I was a kid, it was a small world, it was a small island on the west coast of Scotland, and now making wildlife documentaries, I seek out wild places the world over. You know, I do that for my job, but more importantly than do that, I do it because I'm passionate about these places. When I was younger, I don't think I was aware of human-wildlife conflict, but I was definitely aware of the control that humans have over wild places and wild animals. I was very aware that many of the species that did cause conflict in the past are no longer present in the United Kingdom. I'm glad to say that attitudes have changed, and we are looking towards sort of a relationship where we're not trying to control nature, we are striving to coexist with it. Coexistence is complicated, but it's a challenge that is not going away. The coexistence challenge exists today partly because of the mistakes that have been made in conservation in the recent past. Conservation that's been well intended, but which has overlooked the rights of people and interfered with historical balances in the human-wildlife relationship.
I think traditionally in Africa, amongst indigenous peoples and local communities, the wildlife resource was seen as a shared resource, and there was a sense of stewardship over the entire system because there were no fences, there were no boundaries. So there was free movement for wildlife. They might have been in your area one day and might have been out of it the next day. and you use that as it occurred. With fortress conservation, what happened was these areas actually got fenced in, and communities were excluded, forcibly excluded from these areas. The result of that has been a very negative response from these communities that formerly considered these places their homes and formerly were able to use the resources available in these areas. And this has taken a toll on wildlife because of the negative response of communities to fortress conservation.
From time immemorial, we are Kunda people who live in this place. Traditionally, we are hunters. Our ancestors were hunters, so they used to live with wildlife and their interaction. So there's a lot of good things that we get from wildlife. Yeah, apart from the problem that we encounter as we interact, some animals have been hunted for meat, food, some for medicine, and some just for cultural interaction, that relationship with the wildlife. Because of the increase in human population and also the increase in wildlife, there is sometimes our relationship has been unfair, especially when there's an accident that happens. But above all, we still see wildlife as part of our culture and our heritage. The human population in the country is really going up. I think we have a growing population, and that is an issue of concern. Because we know that as long as the population increases, and especially as more and more people continue to reside in the rural areas, then there will be more competition over access to land, access to resources, because we need the same forest for honey collection, fruits collection, and the wildlife also need the same forest. So, so the human population is definitely going up.
Climate change is also putting pressure on traditional practices of communities in terms of how they farm. It also forces people and wildlife to change their habits in search for water.
Yeah, climate change has become a big issue in several respects. One, when it comes to agriculture production, the seasons have really shifted. That shift has a lot of implications in terms of what seed we can grow, and also it also has implications for availability of water supply for both wildlife in the park and as well as people. You now have to dig deeper to get sufficient water, and our animals in the park sometimes have to come out and share some water resources with neighboring communities, again resulting in a human-wildlife conflict around water.
In many conservation areas, species are either being reintroduced or brought in for the very first time. What kind of tensions and challenges do you think an elephant would cause in your back garden? In mid-2022, 263 elephants were translocated north to Malawi's Kasungu National Park.
For some people, they were seeing the elephant for the first time, and then not knowing also that the animal is a dangerous one. So that too is an important issue. Yes, there is a fence, but apart from the fence, I think we can also do some livelihood activities, because studies done around Kasungu National Park, there was a SAGE assessment which was done. People have no food, they are sleeping hungry, and they know they can go into the park, get an antelope, sell, or cut some firewood, burn charcoal, sell in our burgeoning, our growing town of Kasungu. They'll make money. So the temptation becomes larger because they want to put food on the table for their family. But in the process, they're breaking the law. And when they meet the law enforcement officers in the park, they are arrested.
At home here in Scotland, I met with Elliot McCandless from the Beaver Trust. This charity restores animals to habitats where they thrived in the past, with the goal of building climate-resistant landscapes here in the UK. Talking to Elliot, I was struck by how the controversies around the introduction or movement of animals echoed some of the conversations I'd had in Africa.
And I think a really important part to recognise is that the people who deal with the conflicts are not the same people who necessarily get the benefits, if that makes sense. And so we need to kind of, there is management and mitigation schemes that can be implemented that can help people who are suffering with conflicts. Yeah. And so, Nature Scotland and Natural England have management hierarchies where they kind of go through the lowest level of intervention first to the highest level, which is obviously trap and remove of animals, which is what we have to unfortunately do at some sites. But it's really site specific, and this is what's really difficult about it, is you can have flat arable areas where there isn't a conflict because of the way the water runs or the topography of the site, or you can have other areas where it isn't flat arable land, where it's maybe like sheep farming where there is a conflict. So it's really site dependent, and that's what makes it, there's no one, it's very hard to generalize what those conflicts are, and you have to be kind of open to talking through what is your conflict and understanding how.
And I think that's the only way you can achieve sort of peaceful coexistence, and the whole theme of this podcast series is the coexistence challenge. And really there's no difference, whether you're talking about free roaming elephants or lions or leopards in southern Africa, or whether it's beavers here. These are landscapes where there are people and there is wildlife, and there has to be, to achieve peaceful, harmony and peaceful coexistence, it has to be, I suppose, you have to find the right place. Coexistence is a centuries-old part of life for many people around the world, and for that reason there is hope that we, as a global conservation community, listen and learn from tried and tested ways of living successfully with wildlife. It's not just age-old traditions that are offering hope for the future. Many of the people I've met are pioneering new methods and ideas to create economies and value with or without the support of governments.
We've also seen that the wildlife population is also increasing. We are happy. We're happy that the wildlife population is increasing, because the more wildlife we have, the better our economy. And we use both here. The park provides opportunity for photographic tourism, where we don't harvest and lodges mushroom, people get employed as guides and so on. But outside in the buffer zone, we also use mixed land use approach. We allow agriculture, but also at the same time we allow scientifically driven sustainable conservation hunting to try and manage the numbers, but also at the same time to try and create an incentive. So all these things, when you package together, contributes to effective human-wildlife interaction.
Everywhere I visited, the same conversation came up. Some human-wildlife conflict might be mitigated through compensation, but depending on where you live, it can be challenging getting the financial support you need to survive.
We do not have any compensation scheme currently. So once you lose your livestock or have a permanent disability like myself or injury, there is no kind of any assistance that you can get from the relevant authorities.
So for your injuries, your disability, you didn't get any compensation at all?
There was no any form of compensation or relief aid that I received. I was once referred to social welfare for assistance. I was issued a card for grants disbursement, the social grant disbursement, but I went there 2004. After 3 months, I could not get anything. I went back towards 2004 end of year. I could not get anything in that card till now. I haven't received any sort of fund or relief aid.
Yeah.
There is actually no compensation that you would receive for a goat that is been bitten. Mr. Rian does not know of any scheme or has not received something yet. Which he noted is that except the conservancy program which he introduced, which he says that quite recently he heard that there's an application process from the conservancy in order to get an offset, not really a compensation, but it's just a certain amount to assist you. But something very important that Mr. Rian noted is that since there's no other help, he will have to walk with the animals. He will have to make sure that he's here 24/7. He will have to make sure if it rains that he walks in the rain. If it's hot, he's going to walk in the heat. If it's windy, he's going to walk in the wind.
When looking at solutions to dealing with human-wildlife conflict, it's clear that the expertise lies within the communities themselves. Around Zimbabwe's Gonarazu National Park, some fencing is in place to protect crops and livestock, but many areas are also unfenced, meaning predators can just come and go as they please. Traditionally, and before the introduction of national parks, the local people built kraals to protect their animals. That's something they continue to do to this day.
Our forefathers, and we were still young boys by then, in terms of the structural strength of the cross, it was a bit different from what you are seeing here. We could use very, very strong and very long posts like this one that he is pointing to construct. But however, with evolving times, now we are trying as much as possible to minimize cutting down indigenous trees. So it also becomes a challenge to us to continue practicing what our forefathers were doing. But that was one of the measures. We could also, after such a strong structure, put fire around the crow during the night. We could hear lions from a distance, but they could not come and attack our cattle. Also, during that time, our fathers had our traditional religion that they could do to protect their head. That even during the day they could pass by lions sleeping by the side, but it was also one of the measures that are with times evolving, then we lose that touch of the real African tradition that was used by our forefathers.
So my role is to make sure to raise awareness, to go into the schools, into the community, to host meetings. We attend meetings representing the organization to raise awareness on these issues of human-wildlife conflict, whereby, like I said yesterday, that I never liked these wild animals. Growing up as a kid, I never liked these wild animals because I grew up with that negative mind that I've been hearing from the families, from the friends, that these wild animals are very dangerous. I never saw the positive outcome out of it. But now, after joining Wild Crew as a community education officer, I'm the one now teaching my own community how to conserve and the benefits that we get from these wild animals, not singing the bad parts of them. Yes, I know sometimes they're not good, but at least now it's like my eyes have opened.
Mabusa views are part of a movement that suggests everyone should benefit from the wildlife that surrounds them. Community-based natural resource management, or CBNRM for short, is an approach rooted in community. The community get to decide upon a structure and purpose, and its members to cooperate to manage their natural resources, from water to wildlife.
We have a CBNRM policy supported by government, and it empowers the local communities to those who are living with the wildlife. And it ensures that they are able to manage these natural resources, and they are able, as a community, to decide what happens with the income they accrue from the wildlife. So I think it is working in Namibia. We are talking about 86 communal conservancies in Namibia, and we still have other communities who are in the process of meeting the milestones for gazettement so that they can be registered and have conservancies. I think is a program which targets the rural communities, and we feel it is empowering. They raise their capacities are raised, because we believe if rural communities have the rights over their wildlife, and they have the capacity to govern these resources and an ability to generate benefits from the resources, then we'll have an improvement of their livelihoods as well as the natural resources.
We see that these things actually work, and that the community members' lives can actually be a little bit better, because the capital projects that we bring in does not exclude the non-registered members. It includes everyone. The Conservancy, with their benefit distribution plan that we have, assists all the schools in the area, the creches, the churches, the businesses, the youth that want to start up, the elderly that want a Christmas parcel at the end of the year, and so forth. And these benefits, the good thing about it is they are decided by the community members at the AGM itself and adopted then and there. And then my job as the manager is just to work out so that these things can just happen.
We have in Southern Africa is the only example of nature being given back to people in the world. And it's also the place where wildlife is recovering the fastest. But it comes under a lot of pressure because in many ways it threatens the status quo. It's a different way of doing things. It's a completely different paradigm, because we want to own wildlife, we want to trade wildlife, we want to hunt wildlife, and nobody likes that, because the culture of the top-down fortress and fines conservation is you can't touch wildlife.
In rural communities where there is wildlife, there are problems, there are challenges that people go through. Either they get attacked, or people losing lives, or people being maimed, becoming disabled the entire their life, or the loss of properties and so on. But these are things that we've accepted to live with. But what we need is additional incentives that can be created by the biodiversity industry, so that people we don't even want politicians to take an opportunity to change laws that will disadvantage or that will drive the wildlife into extinction because of wanting to mitigate the human-wildlife conflict. So what we want is economic incentives that are created that people can continue to love the wildlife as they've been doing. We need some mechanisms that should support, relief measures. If compensation is a too strong term, but we still need some form of, mechanism. People who get affected or people who get injured by the wildlife, through the local institutions, through the established systems, there should be some form of social support that should be given, so that the livelihoods of the people should not be curtailed because one of the lead member of the family either was killed or was maimed by the wild animal.
Conservation now finds itself at a tipping point, but the success of a community-led approach isn't something that is down to communities alone.
The idea is that we have at Gemma is the fact that we can't separate conservation from people. The people in Africa are on the ground, living every single day with wildlife, having to face the challenges of living with wildlife. And so Gemma is really about helping the world understand exactly what that involves. It's about asking the difficult conservation questions. It's about dealing with the important conservation issues. And that is, as we see it, this coexistence between communities in Africa that are on the ground living with wildlife. Over 70% of the conservation estate in Africa lies outside of formal protected areas. So it's really difficult for many people, perhaps in the global north, to try and comprehend exactly what it's like living with an elephant in your garden or a lion on your doorstep. So really it's this message that we're trying to articulate in the global north, and not we ourselves as JAMA articulated, but really get the community voice to tell the story and explain to people how challenging this really is. And they are the stewards of our wildlife. We as a global community have great expectations of them to protect our biodiversity, etc. So we think at JAMA that it's really important that we listen to their story.
If there are people or organizations or donors of goodwill who want to support conservation of Kasungu National Park and other protected areas in Malawi, we would advise that they put the money, they share the money between investment inside the park for whatever technical processes that are going inside the park, and then on the edges of these parks, which are densely populated by people, put some money there for livelihood activities, whether it's agriculture, production, whether it's business enterprises, whatever it may be. That way you have a balanced approach.
JAMA International also works with non-governmental organisations or NGOs to empower or support communities to lead innovative schemes and create value for wildlife. But that is not without its challenges.
I think there's a lot of challenges in dealing with communities from a large NGO's perspective. And a lot of that revolves around, in my opinion, the short funding cycles, which are not necessarily driven by NGOs, but rather larger donor organizations. And the result of that is a situation where communities are involved in projects around conservation for normally short periods of time, 2 to 3 year projects, and then immediately that project falls away. There's often no funding to continue to support it. And unfortunately, these things take time. To run successful conservation projects with communities takes time. And what happens then is you get a lot of disillusionment in the communities, and very often other NGOs, a different NGO will come back to the same area with the same idea. And what we're realizing is that we get what we call community fatigue. And that is resulting from this cycle where communities get engaged in projects constantly. They're often not successful. Communities don't see results out of them. They don't see benefits coming out of them. And so we found really that the smaller NGO conservation approach, and particularly the JAMA approach, is a more successful one. And that's really empowering communities, looking at long-term sustainable financing for these kind of projects, even if it starts slow and takes time to incubate. We found that we've had a lot more success with that kind of approach and avoiding the short funding cycles.
We're at a stage now over time where people really believe that we're actually invested in them and their future and their coexistence story. So when a project first comes in, especially an outside project, essentially like us, you know, the feeling is, well, you'll be here for a few years and then you'll leave and our lives will go back to how they were before. And it's only really over time, you know, in keeping on showing up and keeping on greeting the community and having our guardians out on patrol on a daily basis, that I think you can build that true trusting relationship with the community. And then you can start to talk to them about bigger, more ambitious ideas. If we'd come in at the beginning and had, you know, said, oh, well, we want to revolutionize the way that you farm your cattle, for example, we wouldn't have been taken seriously. So I think that longevity and that true partnership with the community, not just a project that's coming in and being imposed and then leaving after a short period of time, but saying, okay, no, if everything falls into place correctly, we want to be here for the next 10, 20 years.
In over 30 years as a documentary maker, I've told stories of the natural world, but also on occasions of people's relationships with wild animals. But my visits to countries as varied as Botswana, Namibia and Malawi, it's given me a new perspective on how people are pioneering ways of making life work for humans and for wildlife. And in a world where there's increasing pressure from climate change, population growth and competition from space and resources, these hopeful ideas are something we all need to hear.
There's this amazing cultural acceptance, and I've seen it in Africa, I've seen it in Asia, that these people have that are living side by side with wildlife for the wildlife itself. And that's born out of thousands and thousands of years of culture, of people living together with wildlife, of the huge respect they have for these animals. And they're part of the cultural system, they're part of their legacy, they're part of their history, they're often part of their religion. And this generally lends itself to this amazing resilience, this amazing tolerance of people in these countries and in these places to wildlife. And I think that's really an incredible lesson that we could learn in the global north. You don't see that a lot, that kind of resilience, that kind of tolerance. So it's actually really amazing.
It's heartening to walk away with a positive vision for the steps being made towards a workable coexistence between humans and the wild animals that surround them. And when like-minded people get together to tackle the biggest challenges faced by our planet and its people, real change can happen, and both communities and the natural world can thrive. I hope you've been able to reflect upon the stories from the people we've met, to consider how you'd feel and think if this was your family, your community, your country, and perhaps start a conversation wherever you call home. If you want a few ideas next time you're planning a holiday, choose tourism options that benefit local communities and support conservation efforts. That means looking for lodges and tours that are community owned or that contribute directly to wildlife conservation and local economies. Help Indigenous people sustainably manage and benefit from their natural resources. Hold your government, your MPs and your MEPs, if you have them, to account when it comes to international policies. Engage on social media, in community groups, through writing. Help the likes of JAMA International share the stories, struggles and successes of the people who are coexisting with wildlife. You can find out more by visiting jamainternational.com. Thank you for joining me beneath the bay above. I was really moved by the respect and value for nature held by so many of the people I met. It's an attitude that can only come from truly understanding what it is to share space with these creatures.
When we went to these areas, we did know, these are villages that are living right in wildlife corridors, they're living right next to national parks, they're living inside wildlife areas. And we had people already set up to speak to. But our plans did change sometimes when we got there, because we realized that it didn't actually matter that we'd already identified people, because as soon as we went into a village and they knew that we were talking about wildlife conflict, immediately we had multiple people come up to us saying, well, can I tell my story too? It's one of the other real purposes of this podcast, is to be able to share these stories and also be able to amplify what is working, to be able to see if that can be replicated in other areas.
Despite this fact that many people had been severely compromised, their health had been compromised, their livelihoods had been compromised, they themselves, in telling the stories, would still tell a story of hope about wildlife, and the fact that they didn't want every elephant just to be extinguished because they had perhaps been hurt by an elephant, and they didn't want lions to go extinct because they perhaps had lost someone or wildlife to lions. And that was just really beautiful to me and really touched my heart. And I felt, well, if they can have that kind of tolerance and they can have that kind of acceptance, how much more should we be willing to reach out and help as much as we possibly can to make sure that that kind of suffering doesn't have to happen?